A Glance in the Mirror, Chapter 8, Village Fair. The Collings cottage stood next to the old ford, now bridged over. On a summer's day, the parapets afforded a convenient leaning place for members of the community to gossip over, discussing questions of the day and those things that concern the village. It is quite narrow, only allowing the easy access of hay-cart and driven flock or herd. It was originally built to save wet feet in times of flood and allow the passage of pack-horse and drover's cart. It is, like many others, picturesque. With a single arch, the swift-flowing water opens out downstream, where the depth lessens, allowing the rounded pebbles to make the water chuckle and gurgle on its way to the reed bed lower down. The garden gate opened onto School Lane, a road linking the Crossways corner to the distant watermill, past school and shop to Chard Junction, the nearest railway station. The name Street has a Roman origin, for paved way, and this one linked all the main features of the village, making it a frequent meeting place for passengers marching by. As with all outlying villages, they were self-sufficient, providing all the necessities for life. Up until the 20s, they provided the jobs too, and many workers had bicycles, and the carrier ran his delivery. There were very few changes to the village structure, for the same families existed from generations past. Everyone knew everyone else. There was no need to write the full address on an envelope, for the person's name and village were quite sufficient. The mass exodus from the village began after the war in the 50s, when young folk leaving school looked beyond the village. The change was remarkable for not only its completeness but also its speed. Occasionally a clatter of hooves announced a herd of cattle or sheep being driven by off to Chard Market. The accurate passage of time was not recognised, for very few persons had wrist watches and only the older men wore a fob watch. On Sundays, the church bells rang for each service. The church-goers filed past the gate. When the single bell stopped, the latecomers ran. Past summer memories returned. The chirping of the cricket, the buzz of the bees, and the cock crows to the cackle of laying hens. In outlying districts, oxen would provide the main pulling power. Horses in areas with lighter soil, women and men would follow along to break up the clods. The only relaxation from the grind of everyday work is a trip to market for the family. The wives and daughters would be in their best dresses, their husbands in cord cap and tweed. The rat and rabbit catcher were still an occupation, each dead animal paid by the tail. Hunting was a fashionable sport. Sheep grazed on light arable land like the Dorset Downs. The shepherd and his dog could still be seen standing guard over the flock. Repairing his pens, erecting hurdles, setting up his troughs and hay racks, whilst living in the movable corrugated hut on wheels where he sleeps, in a bunk warmed by a small cooking stove during lambing time. Hand shearing, sometimes done by a single shearer and at other times a gang, began in early spring. Chard Market, which opened each week, was one of the main cattle and sheep sales for the area and covered a large site with hundreds of pens. The auctioneer would be heard calling out the prices whilst the sheep gave voice and the cattle bellowed. This weekly market was what the rural community looked towards each week. It gave the chance to sell their produce, hear the latest news, and to keep up with the prices. Streets would be sealed off. complete flocks and herds driven in to be placed into their stalls and pens. This was the opportunity for the wives to visit the shops and buy the produce that could not be produced at the village. There were many customs and festivities, all eagerly looked forward to, and if possible attended. Mumming plays, May days, and a carnival procession, following the hobby horse, raising the maypole, Morris dancing, the harvest customs, bonfire nights and wakes, wassailing on Twelfth Night, and the local hunt meet. Every year there were flower shows, fairs, fetes and feasts. Showmen's vans and carts displaying the garish and colourful posters, merry-go-round stalls, roller halfpenny, coconut shies, gingerbread and lollipops. The showman's drum would beat and calls made to gather in the customers. Bells would ring and the one-man band would start up. The Jumble sale gave the villagers the chance to acquire cast-offs, and the unfitting given a new lease of life. Chipped plates aplenty, and broken children's toys, all were queued for long before the opening hour. The stall which held the greatest attention was the children's clothes. There were little by-your-leaves, but an undignified scramble. Jumpers and blouses held up to the child to assess the correct size. The rector circling the heaving mass, never ceasing to be amazed by the aggressive tactics of the mothers. He was still due his tithes, 1/10 of the annual produce from each parish. Even though this was reduced in 1836, many refused to pay it. There was much unrest, and many court orders were issued, and even at the turn of the century, through the end to the end of the First World War and shortly after, tithes were paid. His control and standing soon began to fall off, never to assume its previous privileged position. The farm worker who looked after the horses was on many farms also the ploughman. He rose early to tend his horses that had to be fed 2 hours before they started work, and during this time of cleaning, feeding and watering, the ploughman had his own breakfast. When all was ready, the horses were led out of the field previously marked out for ploughing, and an aiming stick planted to give a guide for the first up farrow. The second down farrow leaned against the first, making a ridge. As centre farrow, the ploughman only worked for 1 continuous hour, giving the horses a rest before starting up again. Ploughing was an autumn job, always a rush to see who could start first after the harvest over and old ricks broken up to be spread, or to be ploughed in, along with stable scrapings and contents of the dung heap. Even during the Second World War, these workings, those who work in the land, continued to follow the old customs and attitudes. The ploughman, who worked alone, and his fine team of horses, would plough and harrow the field, ready for the seed to be sown by drilling. He lurched all day along with one leg down the farrow and the other up, turning the fire-blackened stubble of the previous year, watching the lifted turf roll off the mould-board to compost down the top surface. During their breaks the horses would be given their nose-bags containing oats and chaff. As soon as the team returned to the plough, the huge flocks of seagulls that came straight in from the sea at Seaton and Lyme Regis followed behind. Most of the fields had their attendant rusting farm implements stored away in odd corners. The sprouting corn, weeds and brambles slowly hid them from sight until they formed part of the hedgerow. The productive arable land was not so intensively managed in the early 30s. Later on, when Britain tried to be more self-sufficient, every spare piece of land was used to produce food. It was known that lime and sulphuric acid washed out of the soil and should be replaced. Lime was the chief dressing, which then began to be used extensively in the autumn. When Elsie was born, and for some years after, it would not have been strange to see oxen ploughing. Oxen had been used for farm work long before the horse in all corners of the world. Their working ability after training was the same, although the ox, stronger, could deal with land that is more difficult, but they were slower. Their keepers took as much time over their appearance, with the tips of their horns capped in brass and bells beneath their necks. A farmer would use an ox because they existed on coarser food and were fast eaters, withstood worse weather, and after a couple of years could be fattened and sold at market. They were the cheaper option. Needing no shoeing, horses were mainly for personal riding and carriage work. When fat beef cattle was preferred for slaughter, the life of the ox became less secure. The advent of the tractor finished their working life completely, and that of the ox carter. After ploughing in the stubble, spread manure and yard waste, the field was left for the frost to work at, ready for harrowing in the spring. The cereal varieties have changed over the years to ripen quicker and have shorter stalks. Although this is good for the farmer, it was not good for the wildlife. The poor, unfortunate field mouse no longer builds its nest at the top of a swaying cornstalk. Some of the fields were left in fallow for the next year, and others planted with pink clover, vetch, yellow mustard, or broad bean. These were used as animal fodder, whilst the livestock fertilized the ground as they fed. Swedes were grown as an animal crop, either dug up or fed to the cattle, or the sheep turned into a fenced section of the field to graze, the shepherd daily moving the hurdlers until the whole field was covered. Later on, the flock would be moved into shelters, still using the hurdles and bales of straw to enclose an area for the ewes to have their lambs. Coupling up a horse to the shafts of a horse-drawn hut on wheels, the shepherd would tow the hut to a convenient spot close to the flock and out of the wind. The hut was necessary for him to stay with his dog day and night to guard the flock and to administer to the needs of the ewes shortly to give birth. The shepherd's hut contained a bed, a chair, a small stove to provide some heat and cook his meals. He would stay there until lambing was over. The shepherd's son was 13, coming on 14, entrusted with looking after a flock of sheep on the common. He drove the sheep, taking a number of different routes to crop new grass along the way. The road bypassed sown crops and populated hamlets, keeping off roads and highways. Taking in the lie of the land, the lark soared overhead, the growing wheat, the frisking rabbits, along the path that led to stream and brook, giving water to the hurdle flock as it passed. This was a treat, a change from the turnip. In the past, 40 years previously, at the turn of the century, there had been a recovery from the imported corn and lamb, and once again the farmer who had survived the bad years started to receive the benefits of patience and perseverance. Not these things got back to pre-1870, but they were certainly better than the 90s. In the good old days, the farmers planned a succession of crops for the sheep, mainly vetches, clover and turnips. With the hurdle fold moved daily, the shepherd rationed what food was available. Lambing occurred in February, and within the hurdles were bales of hay placed to afford a shelter and food. Although it was a bad month for the uncertain weather, it did take regard of the coming spring and the new shoots of grass. The coming summer markets were the goal of the shepherd, his every working moment now directed to achieving the best fattening for the new lambs. Farmers who had the space built lambing pens in the barn, but were more anxious and concerned about the shepherd who did not have this luxury. Often you could see, as you passed along the lane, a corner of a field sheltered by high hedges, the lee protected from the prevailing winds. Close to the corner, a rick, placed there since time immemorial for the same reason. It was to be the fourth side to use as a pen, the meeting the two corner hedges, and a set of hurdles, the third. Perfect for the job, as the lambs were born more individual coops constructed from bales and hurdles inside the main pen. This was no spur-of-the-moment device, but one handed down through the centuries. The shepherd's life was an exacting one. For about 6 weeks his hut on wheels emitted smoke from the bent chimney from his tiny round stove. The morning fry-ups, always with ample early morning mushrooms, smelt fantastic as the sausages spat and sizzled. He tramped his daily rounds every few hours with his trusty dog, whose post was at the foot of the steps leading to the shepherd's hut, remained his domain. The bed, with the colourful crocheted cover, remained unmade. No need to be worried about being chastised for not being tidy. The small table and rickety chair, the only furniture, softened by a dusty print hanging askew, and from projecting wooden pegs an assortment of aprons, straps, and topcoats. For this period he was the key worker, receiving due deference from passers-by and other farm workers who acknowledged his importance. His boss kept him supplied with bacon, sausage and bread, and topped up his jar of ginger beer. Within the time allowed for lambing, the first green tender points of new grass began to show. It was getting on for late April, when it was time to move the ewes and their youngsters down to the meadows. Still the ground was penned to allow the new grass to have a chance to grow, and with 2 or 3 weeks the whole field would be opened up. By May there was an abundance of clover, vetches, pea, old dredged corn, and wild rye to feast upon. Haymaking time was fast approaching.